Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a genuinely fascinating piece of legal history, drawn directly from a source article by Islamic Civilization. We are going to explore how a 7th century Islamic Pledge of Allegiance, specifically the one given to the third Caliph, Uthman bin Affan, forms a foundational argument for modern constitutional governance. It is really incredible to see how this ancient precedent is argued to shape the very contemporary political structures we rely on today.
Here's a quick look at our roadmap for this explainer of the source material. We'll define the concept of the bay'ah, look at Uthman's historic pledge, break down principles versus individual opinions, tackle a few historical disputes, and finally look at modern constitutional application.
All right, Section 1, the concept of bay'ah, the contract of leadership.
To really get what the source is arguing, we have to grasp this baseline concept. The text defines the bay'ah, not as some divine right or a blank check for absolute power, but as a binding contract. And here's the kicker. The electoral representatives, known as the Ahlul Halli wal Aqd, actually had the power to add extra specific conditions to this pledge. It wasn't just, you're the boss now. If the ruler accepted these conditions, he was legally bound to them. It's a literal two-way street of accountability.
The author grounds this whole legal concept right in the Quranic obligation to fulfill contracts, citing Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 1. This establishes a rock-solid religious and legal baseline that a contract once made is sacred. And honestly, this sets the perfect stage for the high-stakes precedent that kicked in right after the passing of the second Caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab.
Moving into Section 2, Uthman's historic pledge and the 3-day Shura Council.
The context here is basically a historical thriller. Following Umar's assassination, there was a strict 3-day deadline to pick a successor. To put that into perspective, they only had 3 days to decide the fate of an entire empire. A council of 6 conducted the shura, or consultation, and appointed Abdurrahman ibn Auf as the arbitrator. The source details how seriously he took this. By night 3, he is literally staying awake, going door to door, consulting the inhabitants of Medina to get a true consensus. Finally, by the morning of the 4th day, Uthman emerges as the official choice.
But the leadership wasn't just handed over unconditionally. When Abdurrahman offered the position to Uthman, he explicitly attached a condition to the contract. He essentially said, I'm giving you this pledge on the condition that you follow the precedent of not just the Prophet, but the 2 caliphs after him, Abu Bakr and Umar. Uthman agreed to it, and boom, this conditional contract created a definitive legal consensus across the community.
Which brings us to Section 3, Principles versus Individual Opinions, focusing on Sunnah as methodology.
So what did following their example actually mean in a real-world legal sense? Did it mean Uthman couldn't have a single original thought? Absolutely not. The source brilliantly illustrates this by showing how Uthman didn't just blindly copy his predecessor's exact policies. Take a look at these examples. Umar famously refused to risk soldiers on naval expeditions. Uthman, he allowed the very first naval expedition to Cyprus. Or take stray camels. Umar's policy was to leave them entirely alone. But as the state grew, Uthman flipped that policy, ordering them to be publicized and sold to protect their value.
Okay, so how do we resolve that apparent contradiction? The text explains this through the concept of usul ul-fiqh. The condition of the bay'ah meant Uthman was bound to the foundational legal principles, the underlying methodology used to extract rulings, established by Abu Bakr and Umar. It didn't mean he was chained to their specific day-to-day policy opinions. He was acting as an independent jurist, actually more accurately, a mujtahid, making fresh decisions for entirely new circumstances, but staying strictly within that established methodological framework.
Let's transition to Section 4, addressing historical disputes, specifically looking at the narratives surrounding Ali and a group called the Sabbats.
History always has its counter-narratives, right? The source objectively tackles a very common historical question. Did Ali ibn Abi Talib miss out on the caliphate because he explicitly refused this condition to follow Abu Bakr and Umar? While some reports claim exactly this, the author notes that researchers actually viewed these narrations as weak in their chain of transmission, and more importantly, they completely contradict Ali's actual, documented track record.
I mean, far from distancing himself, the source outlines Ali's massive level of integration into both administrations. Just look at this. Under Abu Bakr, he was a Shura Council member, personal secretary, and head of internal security. Under Umar, he was chief advisor, head of the appeal court, and even the deputy of Medina when Umar traveled. This kind of extensive, high-level cooperation totally undercuts the idea that he refused their methodologies. He was deeply embedded in them.
The source also breaks down a later dispute involving the Sabaris. They essentially accused Uthman of ditching precedent to hoard vast grazing lands for his own personal wealth. But Uthman publicly defended himself by pointing out that the state's military and tax-collected camels had drastically increased. So expanding those grazing lands wasn't a deviation. It was actually a direct, faithful application of Umar's foundational principles, just scaled up for a much larger state. The underlying principle didn't change at all, just the deed did.
And that takes us to our final section, Section 5, Modern Constitutional Application Binding the Ruler Today. Let's see how the author takes the 7th century jurisprudence and applies it to modern political systems. Pulling a quote from Khomeini, the source argues that a true Islamic state is fundamentally non-totalitarian. Why? Because the ruler's authority isn't absolute. It is strictly bounded by written, agreed-upon conditions. The author posits that this ancient practice of binding a ruler via the bay'ah functions exactly like a modern constitution does today to limit executive overreach.
But the author drops a pretty stark warning for any modern constitutional framers. You absolutely have to avoid vague legal loopholes. The source specifically warns against relying on weak principles like mursala maslaha, which translates to unmentioned public interest. Historically, prioritizing a hazy concept like public interest has been a fast track to justifying a centralized police state or even torture and tyranny. The text argues that this directly contradicts the strict nature of Islamic jurisprudence. The rules have to be crystal clear.
So, to prevent the kind of slide into hereditary rule and conflict that plagued later empires, the source advocates that the verbal contract of the bay'ah needs to be codified into a formal, written constitution today. They propose a few concrete mechanisms, establishing a highly formal constitutional process for appointing the leader, empowering a fully independent mazalim or grievance judiciary to keep the ruler in check, and creating an elected majlis, a house, to hold the government continuously accountable to the people.
Ultimately, this explainer of the source material leaves us with a really provocative thought. If a verbal contract from 1400 years ago could successfully put hard legal limits on the most powerful person in an empire, how should modern societies structure their own constitutions to guarantee actual, true accountability today? It is an absolutely fascinating look at where history, law, and modern statecraft intersect. Thanks for joining us to explore this text, and as always, keep questioning the structures around you.